Barbara.
Live.
Okay, we're glad to see you all after a big break, and this is going to be a really great lesson this morning. I'm very excited about leading us through this, and unfortunately, it's going to be the second half of Hebrews 11. We did the first half, but it was about a month ago, so you probably forgot everything we learned. But this lesson is going to stand on its own, and it's going to bless you. And so what I'd like to do, though, is to reread Hebrews 11. So open up, and we'll get started. Adrian, you can come sit over here if you want. So you open seat, and there's a.
Wayne, can I sit with you? Sure, please.
There you go.
Well, I'm going back. We'll make up our mind here.
Okay. I'm sorry. Well, let's open up to Hebrews 11. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, he still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. That's a rousing chapter, isn't it? That's called, of course, the Hall of Faith, or the Faith Hall of Fame. This section contains the author's discussion about Abraham. We're going to start today. We talked about the first part of this chapter last week. We're going to start now with verse 17. And starting in verse 17, the author continues his discussion about Abraham. Abraham, of course, what was the song you sang when you were in Sunday school? Father Abraham has many sons, and many sons has Father Abraham. Did y'all learn that song? Adrian, I know you learned that song.
And there's motions.
Yeah, there's motions, right? Okay, so Abraham, of course, is considered the father of the Jewish faith, the great paradigm of faith. Abraham, in a test by God, offered his son Isaac as a sacrifice. You all remember that story. And this is considered the example par excellence of an act of faith, because there's a seeming contradiction between the promises of God, which were what? What did God promise Abraham?
Be a great nation. You'd be the father of a great nation.
His children would be like the stars in the sky.
Right. And he waited, he had to wait, and he waited, and he doubted God. And then when he was 100 years old, God provided the son miraculously through his 90-year-old wife, Sarah, right? So do you see the contradiction? Now God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son on the mountain. So how could he fulfill the promise if at the same time call Abraham to sacrifice his son? You see why this is considered the example par excellence. I mean, the fantastic example of faith. Abraham was forced into a radical posture of trusting God. The author tells us that, looking at it logically, what does this mean? It means that Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice Abraham and took him up on the mountain, he must have reasoned that therefore God could raise the dead. That's the only way that the promises and the command could both be fulfilled. After this fantastic story of reminding us about Abraham and his faith, he moves rapid fire through Isaac's blessing to his son Jacob. He moves to Esau. He talks about Jacob's blessing the sons of Joseph. And what the point he makes about those patriarchs is that they were given these blessings as they were confronting death, because they were looking forward to things for their people that were still yet unseen. They were wandering around in tents and living in tents. They were living in mobile, they weren't in an established city. They were looking forward to the promises of God that he would make them a great nation and would give them a land. Then we come to Moses. Remember, in chapter 3, earlier in this study of Hebrews, in chapter 3, the author compares Moses, who, remember, in the first century Judaism was considered the greatest man of all time, the greatest man in all of their history. He was looked up to as the greatest man in the history of the Jewish faith. The author in chapter 3 talked about Moses, and we studied Moses because he was pointing out, highlighting, trying to tell these audience of this church in Rome who were in danger of falling away, who were being tempted to fall back because they were being persecuted. And he was showing them how much even greater than Moses Jesus was. And so here we get to the account of Moses. And it begins with the faith expressed by Moses's parents. Because when he was a baby, what is the beautiful thing that the author says? They saw that he was what? No ordinary child. Moses' parents saw that he was no ordinary child. Another way of translating no ordinary child is beautiful before God. They saw that Moses was beautiful before God. His parents had somehow spiritual insight into this baby's significance. And so what did they do? At the risk of their lives, they disregarded the king's edict, because the king had commanded that all the babies be put to death. They disregarded that command. They didn't drown the baby. They weren't afraid of the king's edict. They were bold, and they didn't shrink in front of Pharaoh's proclamation. So you see, Moses' parents had faith. Moses himself exhibited such boldness. The author reminds us that Moses chose to identify with whom? Who did he have to choose between? He chose to identify with his own people, the Hebrews, the slaves, rather than with the godless Egyptians. He chose his own family, meaning his own people, rather than wealth and status and great position in the government. He chose mistreatment. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ, the author says, as of greater value than all the treasures of Egypt. Well, then, by faith, Moses left Egypt, of course, and persevered in the mission given him by God. He left Egypt in a step of faith. This is an interesting analogy. I don't know if you all caught this when you're reading it. He even led the Hebrews to observe Passover before they had even passed over. So he's reading into this that they celebrated the Passover because he had faith that in fact God would let them pass out of Egypt. The event hadn't even taken place. And the peoples themselves had enough faith to cross through the sea, the Red Sea, in obedience to God's command. So he moves on then to Joshua, seemingly similarly to these stories about Moses, seemingly illogical. Under Joshua, the people following God's command, what did they do? They marched around Jericho for 7 days. Now, what kind of logical order does that sound like? And the walls fell down. Finally, he gives an example of a person you may not have remembered from your Sunday school as a child, because it's usually not taught in children's Sunday school. He reminds us of the story of Rahab. Rahab was a prostitute, and God told her that the land where she lived had been given to the Israelites. And so when the spies came in to look over the land and to check out, what they would have to do to conquer it, she helped the spies, the Jewish spies, at great risk, of course, to her own life. Rahab, the prostitute, is in the Hall of Faith. Then, remember, I told you that if you were to listen to this book of Hebrews in its entirety, you can listen to it in about 45 minutes. Jack told me he only allows himself to preach for 20 minutes. Well, back then, the audience was willing to give him a little more time, and so he was preaching for about 45 minutes. Now he's getting frustrated. He says, wait a minute. I got to move on. I know I can talk about this stuff forever. And he says, what more can I say? He says, he sums up his argument. He talks about, but he keeps on going. He talks about 6 more figures spanning the judges and the prophets. And he gives an example list of other people of faith. Gideon. You all remember Gideon? What do you remember about Gideon? The hotel Bibles?
Yeah.
The wet mat,
Huh?
the wet mat. See the one
Oh.
Have lanterns, right?
Okay, so he mentions Gideon, he mentions Barak, he mentions Samson, he mentions Jephthah, he mentions Samuel and David and the prophets. He just rapidly mentions these people in rapid fire order, knowing that the people have probably been taught better than we have, and the people who are in this church, instantly recognize what these people had done. And he says that through faith, some of them conquered kingdoms, Some of them administered justice. Some of them gained what was promised. But some of God's promises weren't fulfilled in their lifetimes. So there's 2 points. One is that God is faithful. He's faithful to his promises. But the second point is people of faith live in the light of God's promises, even though the promise may not be fulfilled in our lifetimes. I want you to think about that for a minute, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of minutes. But then he moves on quickly to Daniel, and he says, Daniel, shut the mouths of lions. And then he talks about Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah, all of whom escaped the sword. But many others whose weakness, like David's, David was weak when we saw him in the face of Goliath, right? He's a young man. I don't know, some people think 12 years old, some people think 17 years old. Nevertheless, he's facing the greatest hero of the Philistines. David, his weakness, God turned into strength. Even death could not stop God from working on behalf of his people. Then he mentions a very obscure example from the Old Testament, the poor women who received their sons back from the dead. Do you all remember that story, those stories? At the hands of Elijah and Elisha. But notice, some experienced resurrection, like these young men. Some were tortured. Some were put to death. Some refused deliverance in light of what? A greater reward that they saw ahead of them. A greater reward than being spared the sword. They faced jeers, flogging, while others were put in prison. Still others were stoned and put to death by the sword, were destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. What does the author say? He says they were all looking forward to an eternal reward. And God himself bore witness to their faithfulness. So what is the main point here? The main point is that faith is the only right path for God's people. It's the only right path for you and me. Faith to live with determination for God, though none of these people received what was promised. Some did receive certain promises, but not the definitive fulfillment of God's promise, which we know and which we look forward to, which is our inheritance. Where? In the heavenly kingdom. We know about this through the new covenant, through the sacrifice of Jesus. So the author is saying that they were looking forward to a savior. They were looking forward to a Messiah. They didn't even have the privilege we have of knowing all about Jesus. They didn't have a New Testament. They just trusted God in his promise that he would deliver them. They didn't experience the coming Messiah. Yet now they are made perfect, the author is saying. They are perfected. Their faith has been made whole because this great faith community, all of these people who remain faithful, the people of God, have been vindicated through Jesus. God has broken into the world in the person of his Son. With us, They now know the perfecting power of Jesus's sacrifice and the eternal inheritance of the saints. So they have received their reward. Okay, I want to turn now to what does this chapter mean for me and you? What is the author trying to do here? He's trying to exhort you. He's trying to exhort me to live boldly for God. The simple truth, as he puts it, is that it's only a faithful life that pleases God. It's only through faith can people live lives of purposeful impact for God. So these heroes that he's listed here are only examples. They're merely examples of a much, much larger host of people, of which you and I are some, whom God is going to say, well done. Isn't that a beautiful thought? Well done. You know, you might say, but these people are heroes. I'm not a hero. Let's look at a couple of pitfalls you and I have. One is to say, but I'm not heroic. I don't know if I could get into the lion's den. I don't know if I could sacrifice my son. I don't know if I could do many of them. I couldn't even listen to God like Rahab did and believe in God and help the spies at the risk of my own life. But the truth is, this is the truth. All of these people are heroes. They're in the Hall of Faith. But let's look at these people, or remember these people, a little bit more closely. These lives are normal. The extraordinary lives these people lived are normal for God's people. This is what C.S. Lewis and the Edwards invited us to. Did y'all see that? There was a C.S. Lewis one-man show down at the North Coast Repertory Theater. It was very good. I don't know if it's still going on. But C.S. Lewis, of course, is one of the greatest Christian theologians and thinkers and writers of the 20th century. What did he call these lives? He called them mere Christianity. Mere Christianity. The purpose of this author of Hebrews is to call struggling, bumbling Christians, you and me, to live boldly by faith. He calls us with all of our hang-ups, all of our bad habits, all of our worries. He's calling us to action. He calls us to step out of step with the world. And I'm pretty much in good step with the world. He's calling me to get out of step with the world, to hop up on the stage, just like all these folks did, and to take our place in God's roll call for the faithful. But you're going to say, hey, teacher, I'm inadequate for this. Okay. If you look at all of these people, all of them were inadequate. If they were adequate, then it wouldn't be God's grace that was on display in all of their stories, and all of their lives. I mean, think about our brothers and sisters in the faith in Saudi Arabia, or China, or Cuba. Their faith is necessary for survival as a worshiping people. We, on the other hand, are comfortable. We're comfortable with the world. Think about all of the displaced Christians in Ukraine. Think about all the Christians left in Syria that is so on Jack's heart. But if you're honest, you'll say that the culture wars that we've been experiencing have been escalating. We must be ready by practicing faith in our daily lives. We must be ready to practice faith in our lives as it regards work, as it regards retirement, as it regards money, as it regards our friends, as it regards every aspect of our life. In whatever our situation, we need to hear God's call to join the ranks of faith examples. Another pitfall that we're subject to is a misconception of Christianity. For example, if you grew up in what is kind of termed a name it and claim it church, a denomination that preaches that God wants you to be wealthy and healthy and prosperous. He wants a life of blessing and bounty, health and wealth. A theology that says God gives good gifts. Well, that's true. God does give good gifts, but it's not necessarily in the wrapper that we're expecting, as witnessed by all the people that I was just referring to all over the world who aren't in a place of comfort in their faith, like a place of comfort in relationship to culture. Another pitfall we fall into is believing that faith is just a matter of creed. This is really important for us because Presbyterians are really a denomination that has always been big on creeds. We say the Apostles' Creed, say the Nicene Creed. Art, you want to recite the Nicene Creed for us? I'm just so we say, what is your Christianity? Well, I believe such and such a thing. Namely, let's say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. Say the Apostles' Creed. That's what my faith is. Guess what? The author here is saying that faith is much more dynamic, much more active, because it's not just giving assent to the truth, it's acting. It's stepping up on the stage and acting in light of those truths. So another pitfall we fall into, maybe not people in this class, but most people, is believing that any faith, as long as it's sincere, whether it's towards Buddha or Krishna or Allah or Jesus, is valid. Those are some of the pitfalls. All of you have fallen into some of those pitfalls at one time or another. But Hebrews 11 portrays faith like this. First of all, it involves confident action. It involves acting purposefully in accordance with what God says. Remember these examples from his dialogue. Abel offered a better sacrifice. Noah built an ark. Abraham got up and left his home country. Abraham later offered Isaac up. Faith acts in bold confidence. Second lesson is that faith is action taken in response to the unseen God and his promises. Faith, as I was talking about the relative to the creeds, faith is more than just a static assent. Yes, I believe that. Faith spurs one to act in accordance with God's truth that I believe. God has spoken. He's manifested himself. How has he manifested himself? He's manifested himself through creation, through his word Jesus, the living word. He's manifested himself through the prophets. He's manifested himself through the Holy Spirit speaking in your heart to the truth. Faith also involves God working extraordinary miracles through ordinary people. You know, all of these people that you just heard about, if you remember what you learned over the years in Bible study or children's Sunday school class, almost all of them, I didn't do an exhaustive, they're very unadmirable people. I mean, remember, what did Noah do? He got drunk and lay naked in his tent and disgraced himself before his family against God's orders. What did Abraham do? Abraham lied. Remember when he was confronted by the foreigners and he, in effect, gave him his wife up. Oh no, she's not my wife, you take her. What about Isaac? Isaac lied all the time. What about Jacob? Jacob was a deceiver. Moses was a murderer. The Israelite people themselves were what in the desert? Grumblers, right? Why'd you lead us out here? Let's go back. We want to go back to slavery. Gideon was a doubter. David, the greatest king, was an adulterer and a murderer. He had the affair with Bathsheba and then had Bathsheba's husband murdered or killed and put him in the front row of the battle. So all of these people in this list are real people, just like me and Ken, Wayne. Not like you. You're a holy musician.
Thank you, sir.
All of these people are real people. They are pilgrims who have yet to reach the heavenly city. They haven't arrived. We too are eligible for enlistment in this army. The faithful in chapter 11 lived in a variety of situations, and there were a variety of outcomes to their lives. The people passed through the sea on the way to the Holy Land, the Promised Land. The walls fell. That's true. The boat was built. That's true. The widows received their dead back. That was true. But Abel got murdered. Abraham had to wait many, many years till he was 100 years old to have this baby. Others, the author says, were tortured, stoned, imprisoned, mocked, destitute, mistreated, sawn in half. The point is, faithful people don't necessarily see the results of the promises being answered in this life. Can you accept that? But faith, in fact, is rewarded by God. So you and I look beyond the immediate. We believe that God rewards those who seek him. Every believer, you and me, long to hear the fantastic words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So faith is confidence that results in that when we step on the stage and we act in faith, we need to do that in all varieties of situations because we're ordinary people, but we need to act in faith in response to a God whom we cannot see, but who has given us promises which we believe. There are going to be various earthly outcomes. Some of us may live lives of normalcy. Some of us are going to go through things that we certainly rather not. But always the outcome is certain. And that is that God is going to commend us and give us our reward. So faith is people, you and me, Shelby and Bill, Susan, Adrian, orienting their lives towards God and his values against the world's perceived values. You and I are called to live in bold confidence in the unseen God, in bold confidence in his word, in bold confidence in his ultimate reward. You and I must focus on greater realities than those that we can simply see with our eyes, or greater realities than can be touched with our hands, or greater realities than can be bought with money. Anybody have any thoughts about this chapter? I tell you what, I'm not going to ask you for thoughts. What I'd like to ask you for is how about 3 people give a testimony about this chapter and how it relates to your life? Maybe has related to your life in the past, or how you're hoping it will relate to your life in the future. You know what happens when nobody jumps in? Jim. Give us a testimony, brother. You know what Peter says? I've told you this many times. Always be prepared to give an account for the hope you have in you. Jim, I apologize. You don't have to say anything. Okay.
Okay, so some of you have seen the timeline before. Do you remember the overall arching timeline that I gave you? So you don't have a whiteboard. So there's a line that goes all the way across here. And the middle of the timeline is the cross. And over there is whenever God created the world, and over at the end of this timeline is whenever Jesus is coming back. There's a timeline, and everything on the Old Testament side of the cross is looking forward in faith to the fulfillment of the promises, which is Jesus. So you just had a little lesson in all these people. There was Noah, there was Enoch, there was Abraham, there was David, there was all these people, these marks on the timeline. They're all looking in faith toward Jesus. And they didn't even know what it's going to look like. They didn't know it was going to be a man. They thought it was going to be a king. They thought it was going to be a, restore a kingdom. But their absolute confidence was that God was going to redeem. And on this side of the cross is all of us. We're over here at about 2000, and we are in the hall of faith too. But there were the people looking back toward the center of history. So each one of you are in the hall of faith, because you're looking back toward the most important thing that happened in history. And then I got this really cool vision this week. Bill gave me this article to read about angels and demons. There were 8 categories of angels. Who knew? So now I've expanded my timeline instead of it being a line. There is a line, but I think now it's a huge circle. And that all these angels up in the heavenly realms are all also looking forward and going to the center of history and worshiping God. And then all the demons that make our life miserable, they're also looking toward Jesus. They don't like him, but that's their whole point. So the entire universe is centered on one historical fact, and that's Jesus. And that's what all these people are looking forward to. And now all of us are on the timeline looking back. We're in the hall of faith.
I got all the answers now.
Okay.